Good morning, Jade Hamilton here, and I've got Miss Frederica Jane with me, aka Freddy, and she's in her little pink Miniland dress still because we've got a very special thing happening today. Who's going to come to our house? Freddy, can you remember? Yeah, that's right. The Stork's going to come. And the Stork's going to drop off Freddy's brother or sister. We don't know who it is yet. The Stork's making it a surprise. So, we don't know who's coming. But we thought we'd do a tag. We'd do On Wednesdays We Wear Pink, which is run by the lovely Shara at Reborn Living Dolls. If you haven't subscribed to Shara already, do. She's absolutely lovely. Her babies are gorgeous, and she has gorgeous tasting clothes. Particularly if you like, very kind of bright and flowery and girly things. She's very, very good at picking out little things like that. As I say, Freddy's got this gorgeous little Miniland dress on that's sweatshirt material at the top. It buttons at the back. It's got bright pink sort of, they look like little Smarties actually, buttons at the back, and it's got embroidery across. It's got butterflies, and it's got little gingham, feel like hearts. Are they hearts? Let's see. Oh, yeah, they are hearts. And it's got a little rose across here, and little embroidered flowers, beautiful. And then it's got a lace trim, which is threaded through with wonderful cerise pink grosgrain ribbon. Oh, sorry, satin ribbon. I've got grosgrain ribbon on the brain. And she's got, and at the bottom it's a very lovely, crinkly pink and white gingham. And Freddy's got her little pale pink Rumberbum tights on as well, and her unicorn bib. Now, we thought that while we wait for the Stork to come, we would read some chapters of Buddy. We're starting from chapter 5 today. As per all videos where I read, all copyright for Buddy goes to Nigel Hinton and to Penguin. I own absolutely nothing. Make yourself comfortable. Grab a hot drink if you've got one, and we'll begin. Chapter 5. The next day went well. For a start, Mr. Normington was away ill, and none of the other teachers said anything about his genes. It was Friday. It was Friday, Buddy's favourite day, a good combination of lessons and the weekend to look forward to. Best of all, Julius and Charmian were back, though they still had sniffly colds, and Julius moaned that their mum always made them go back to school before they were completely better. The history speech went really well too. It was the last lesson of the day, and he grew more and more nervous as it got nearer the time. Then, as soon as he started talking, he relaxed and found he had a lot to say. Mr. Gray said it was an excellent speech. and Buddy sat down feeling great. The only sour note came at the end of the lesson. Everybody was leaving the room, and Charmian patted him on the back and said, "Well done! Terrific speech!" David Siddell, who was just ahead of them, turned round and sneered, "Yeah, not bad for a dustman, was it?" A couple of other people laughed and shouted, "Dustman!" Then Siddell started singing, "My old buddy's a dustman, he wears a dustman's hat. He wears gold blondie trousers and he lives in a council flat." Buddy made a grab at him, but Siddell ducked away and ran down the corridor and began singing again. Buddy started to run after him, but stopped as Siddell dashed out of the main door and away. "Just ignore him," Julius called. "What's he on about, anyway?" Charmian asked. Buddy told them about the incident with Mr. Normington and the litter. They crossed the playground and went through the gates onto the street. "I hate that place," Buddy said, looking back at the school. "Forget it. It's Friday," Charmian said. He waited at the bus stop for the twins' bus and arranged to meet them later at the Satellite. As the bus drew away, he crossed the road and started to walk home. There was no hurry, so he went the long way through the shopping precinct. When he got to Lawrence's, the big department store, he looked at the windows and then went in. Another game. This time it was the "I can walk through here without nicking anything" game. He strolled through the stationery department. He'd nicked a couple of pens from here at the beginning of the year. So stupid. All that risk and worry for a couple of cheap ballpoints. When he'd learned his lesson, he'd never do it again. He stopped in front of the pen counter and picked up a ballpoint that wrote in 3 different colours. He flicked the colour selector and scribbled on the little notepad that was there for testing the pens. It was a good pen. He looked around. Nobody near. He checked the ceiling. Were there any TV cameras? It would be so easy to slip the pen into his pocket. He put the pen back in the display and walked on. There! He'd done it. He passed the test. He could resist the temptation. He walked out of the swim doors and could barely stop himself from smiling. Just imagine if he'd taken the pen. A store detective might now be tapping him on the shoulder and asking him to go up to the manager's office. The police would be called, and they'd take him down to the police station. They'd ask questions about everything. They might even find out about his dad's prison record. He could just see their reactions. They'd shake their heads and say, "Goes to show. Runs in the family. Like father, like son." Well, they were wrong. He'd just proved it, hadn't he? He could have nicked the pen, but he hadn't. He'd learned his lesson. His dad was out, so Buddy had tea on his own. There wasn't a lot to choose from, so he toasted a slice of bread and heated up a small tin of peas. It made a change from beans on toast, but he was still quite hungry when he'd finished. He read for a while, then went up to his room. He wasn't sure what to wear. His parka was really too small, and he couldn't get it on if he wore more than a shirt underneath. In the end, he decided it'd be warmer to wear 2 sweaters instead. The Satellite Youth Club was held in a dingy hall next to the church where the twins went every Sunday. Buddy enjoyed going, though he felt a bit awkward. There was always a worrying moment as he went in, where he would look round anxiously to check Julius and Charmian were there. He'd have to be there on his own, so he usually turned up late. He'd hate to be there on his own, sorry, so he usually turned up late to make sure. He pushed open the door and caught sight of Charmian at once. She was in the middle of the floor, dancing with a couple of other girls. Julius was over by the side door, talking with a tall, thin boy who was wearing a floppy purple corduroy cap and a long black overcoat. Buddy walked round the dance area and joined them. Julius slapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hi!" But the other boy stared at him, then pulled his cap down nearly over his eyes. "This is Buddy," Julius said, but the boy turned away. Julius looked at Buddy and raised his eyebrows. "I'm going to play table tennis," Buddy said quickly and walked towards the far end of the room. He could see the tables were full, but he kept going in order to get away from the difficult situation with Julius's friend. What was it all about? The boy's eyes had been filled with hatred. He watched the people playing table tennis for a bit, then glanced back down the hall. Julius was still talking with the boy, and Charmian was still dancing. He wished he could pluck up the courage to go and dance. Charmian was with Marcia and Estelle, and he knew they would be friendly. He needed a welcome after the coldness from the tall boy, but he hated dancing, especially since the girls danced so well. He looked at the three of them, rocking to the rhythm of the record that boomed from the speakers. They moved together, doing complicated steps, their whole bodies in harmony with each other in the music. Once, one of them made a false step, and they all stopped for a moment. Then they got back into the pattern of steps again, then grinned with pleasure. But he found himself grinning with them. Charmian saw him and waved. It was strange how she could always make him feel happier. Since his mum had gone, she was almost the only one he could speak to. Not about everything, of course. She knew his mum had gone. He told her, even though his dad had said he mustn't tell anyone. Charmian had promised not to say a word. Buddy wasn't bothered about that anyway. He couldn't really understand why his dad was so anxious to hide it. Loads of marriages broke up. What Buddy didn't want people to know was why she'd gone. He'd almost blurted it out to Charmian one day, but at the last moment he'd felt too ashamed. Buddy watched the girls dancing for a bit longer. Then someone called him over to play doubles at table tennis. It was a long, closely fought match, and when he and his partner won, they were immediately challenged by another pair. The second match was just as long and tense, and quite a number of people came over to watch. Buddy glimpsed Julius, but he was too caught up in the match to notice if the tall boy was still with him. Buddy felt good, and he played well. "Hey, you play okay," Julius said, coming up to him at the end. Buddy shrugged, but he felt like smiling. "Where's the other bloke?" "Oh, Dennis, he's gone. Don't mind him. You had a bit of bother from some white kids at his school today." "So did I," Buddy said. Yeah, I should have told him that. Not the same, though." "Why not?" "Just isn't," Julius said vaguely, and then groaned. "Oh, no, it's the minister. Must be nearly time to finish. Let's get Charmian. I want to get out of here before he starts." Julius clattered over a couple of chairs and dashed over to the dance area, but he had to laugh. Julius went through things, not around them, and he always moved at a mad speed. Mad speed. Charmian was only half an hour older, but looking at them now, you'd never guess they were twins. Julius was jumping around and waving his arms like a kid, while Charmian, taller and smiling gently, trying to calm him down. Okay, Jules, Charmian was saying as Buddy walked up. Just don't make it obvious. Come on, Buddy. Come on, Buddy. We've got to sneak out. Jules thinks he's too cool for prayers. They moved casually to the side of the hall, around the side of the hall, until they were near the exit. They watched the minister hold up his hands as a signal that the club was closing. The record was switched off, and everyone stopped. The minister walked to the middle of the hall, and as he turned his back, Julius whispered, "Now!" They slipped out through the door, followed by a couple of other people. Julius laughed in triumph. "You wait," Charmian said. "I bet he noticed. He'll say something about it on Sunday. Who cares? You shouldn't do prayers at the club. It's not a church," Julius said, and then began imitating the minister. "Brethren, don't let us forget to thank the Lord for our pleasure this evening. Thank him for the music." He did it so well that even Charmian had to laugh. "Thank him for the electricity. Thank him for the floorboards," Julius went on saying even madder things until they got a fit of giggles that lasted all the way to the fish and chip shop. Buddy said he wasn't hungry and he waited outside while the twins went in. Actually, he was starving, and he moved away from the tempting smell coming out in the warm blast of air. It was quite cold out now, and the inside of the window was all misted over. Somebody was drawing on the steamy glass a picture of a woman with enormous bosoms. Oh. Buddy peered through the lines into the shop and saw Julius's grinning face. "What do you think of my picture of Charmian?" Julius asked as they came out of the shop. "Shut up, Jules. I don't look like that," Charmian said, looking down at herself. "You do, doesn't she, Buddy?" "I do not. Take it back or you don't get any chips." "Okay, you're flat as a pancake," Julius said, holding out his hand. Charmian unwrapped the paper, took out a bag of chips, and handed it to her brother. Then she held out another bag for Buddy. He took a chip, but Charmian said, "Not one, the bag. They're yours." I never said I wanted any, Buddy said, feeling a blush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. "Well, I bought some anyway. You'll just have to take them back, won't you?" He felt stupid as soon as he said it, and he walked away to cover it up. He walked fast, and he heard the twins almost running to keep up. Suddenly, Charmian grabbed him and swung him round. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "Please, I don't want you to pay for them. That was worse." She knew he had no money. Stubborn pride wouldn't let him accept them. "I don't want them." He started walking again. Then Charmian ran past. with Julius after her. She stopped next to a lamppost and held the 3 bags of chips over a litter bin. Julius turned. "Stop her! I'll do it!" Charmian said, and tipped the bag slightly. A couple of chips fell out. "She'll do it, Buddy. She's got mine too." "It's all eat or no one eats," Charmian said, and tipped the bag some more. "Stop her!" Julius shouted. "Okay, I'll eat then," Buddy said, "just for Jules." Charmian smiled and handed him a bag. Julius grabbed his bag and started gobbling his chips as fast as possible. "You're mad, Char. Really mad," he mumbled with his mouth full. "Don't eat and speak at the same time, Jules," she said in a jokey voice. They stopped when they got to the Astoria and looked at the posters and photos outside. There was a film on called Night of Dracula. Julius put 2 chips in his mouth and let them hang out like fangs. I don't know. I don't know why they're always X films. We saw one on TV, didn't we, Shah? And it wasn't scary at all. Some bits were. No, it was dumb. I like monsters better than all that ghosts and vampire stuff. Buddy started telling them what his dad had said about the haunted house. He even made up a few gory details to make it sound more interesting. As they finished the wind blew bitingly cold along the street, and he shivered. "Cool, that's great," Julius said, jumping with excitement. "They ought to make a film about that. Hey, let's go and look at it." "No, it's a waste of time," Buddy said. But there was no stopping Julius. "Oh, come on. Croxley Street's on the way back to our place. We can go and have a look at the house, and then you can come and have a cup of coffee with us." They set off down Malham Road in the direction of Croxley Street while Julius and Charmian were talking and laughing excitedly. Buddy grew more and more uneasy. For a start, he didn't like the idea of seeing a house where a murder had taken place, but it was more than that. For no good reason, he suddenly felt he shouldn't have mentioned the house. Chapter 6. The Germain Arms stood on the corner of Croxley Street and the main road. The pub was bright and noisy, and there were a lot of cars parked in the forecourt. 20 yards further up Croxley Street, however, the light and the sound of laughter and music were left behind. The night closed in, and only a few street lamps cast their circles of light in the darkness of the long road ahead. The houses were tall and set back from the pavement, some with front gardens so large that there were trees in the middle of the lawns. The number of the house next to the pub had been 154. Now they were passing number 82. Buddy calculated quickly. Another 13 houses to go. 13. Unlucky. Another warning. He moved to the edge of the pavement and tried to count the houses, but he couldn't see that far. "Let's cross over so we can see which one it is," he said, and the twins followed him on the other side of the road. Even Julius had stopped chattering. Perhaps he was feeling scared too. The only sounds were their footsteps and the rustling of the trees in the wind. This must be the quietest street in town, and the darkest. Buddy lost count of the numbers, but it didn't matter because when they reached it, it was obvious which one was number 56. Tall brick gateposts guarded the two entrances to the semicircular drive, but there was only one gate, and that was half open and hanging off its hinges. The other entrance looked like a barricade, with wooden posts and tangles of barbed wire. There was a tall, straggly hedge that hid the garden and the lower part of the house, but what Buddy could see made the skin crawl on the back of his neck. The windows were all boarded up, as if what was inside was too terrible to see, or as if someone had tried to stop something horrible from getting out. "It's horrible," Charmian whispered. "Look at those turrets along the roof. It's like a castle." "Dracula's castle, my dear," Julius hissed, and he pretended to bite her neck. "Shut up, Jules, I don't like it," she said, pushing him away. "Doesn't scare me. It's only an old house. I'm going to have a look." Julius stepped off the pavement and walked across the road. He turned and waved to them, then slipped into the gap between the gate and the gatepost. He took a couple of paces up the drive and stood casually with his hands on his hips. Then he turned round and shouted, "See? Nothing!" Suddenly he raised his arms and let out a long, ghost-like howl. He ran out of sight behind the hedge and the noise stopped. There was a long silence. Then Julius's grinning face appeared from behind the post and barbed wire of the other entrance. He waved and called, "Scared you!" He disappeared again behind the hedge and then strolled out the gate and back across the road, looking very pleased with himself. "Your turn, Buddy," he said. Buddy had known that Julius would dare him to go, and he'd made up his mind to say no. But at the last minute he changed his mind. Julius was right. It was only an old house. Even if some people had died there, so what? Most people have died in almost every old people must have died in almost every old house in town. That didn't make them scary. It was just an ordinary old house, and he had to prove it to himself. If not, he'd go on being scared by stupid things like ghosts. "Okay," he said, and started crossing the road. "Go up to the front door," Julius called. "Okay." Yes, he would. He'd go right up to the front door. There was nothing to be afraid of. He had to stop acting like a kid. He was nearly 14 after all. It was ridiculous, all this stuff about ghosts and death. He had to stop it. If he walked up to the front door and stood there while he counted 10, no, 20, it would be like a victory, and all his fears would stop forever. He slipped between the gate and the gatepost. Something cold brushed against the back of his neck, and he jumped. Just a twig from the hedge. It was nothing. He must keep going. His feet scrunched noisily on the gravel, and he stopped. He looked back. He was hidden from the road. All he had to do was wait here for a bit, and then go back and tell them he'd done it. Besides, he was trespassing. Perhaps he'd be caught and reported to the police. Better to go back and stay out of trouble. No, he had to do it. If he cheated, everything would go wrong. He stepped sideways onto the long grass of the lawn. No need to make any noise. Why not? There was nobody inside. It was just an old, empty house. except that a man had stabbed his wife and then killed himself. He crossed the lawn and walked softly across the gravel up to the front steps. The steps were in the middle the wall in the middle for all the people who climbed them, including them, the man and his wife. Buddy got to the top story and looked at the front door. There was an old door knocker in the side of oh dear. There was an old door knocker in the middle, and on either side of it 2 planks had been nailed lengthways, presumably to cover glass panels. Halfway down was a large letterbox. He was going to push it open and look through when there was a noise behind him. He whirled round and saw Julius and Charmian at the bottom of the stairs. "You scared me, you idiots! What are you doing?" "Coming to look," Julius said in a loud voice. "Shh! I'm going to look through the letterbox." As Buddy turned back to the door, Julius skipped up the steps and banged on the knocker. "Sorry. Anyone in?" he shouted. Buddy ran down the steps and onto the lawn. Charmian ran with him, and when they stopped, she called out, "Come on, Jules! Stop being stupid!" Julius took no notice. He banged again, then peeked through the letterbox. "There you are! Nothing! Come and see!" Buddy and Charmian waited for a moment, then moved forward. As they climbed up the steps, Julius suddenly straightened up and burst past them, almost knocking Charmian flying. She grabbed hold of Buddy and shouted, "Julius, stop mucking about!" They watched as he ran down the drive and out the gate. "Idiot!" Charmian said angrily, and stooped to look through the letterbox. Buddy bent down just as she pushed open the flap. Through the large slit they saw a flickering candle and a white face staring at them. Charmian screamed, and together they flew down the steps in terror. Dashing across the gravel, Charmian tripped over the edge of the lawn. She crashed against Buddy, and they both fell onto the wet grass. They stumbled up and ran blindly towards the gate. Buddy banged his elbow as he squeezed through, and a half-sob, half-laugh shook him. His legs felt weak with the pain and the panic, but he forced himself to run. Charmian could hardly keep up with him, but he grabbed her hand and pulled her after him. Ahead of them, Buddy could see Julius appear and disappear each time he ran through a pool of light under the lamps. They didn't stop until they reached the warm brightness of the Germain Arms. Julius was already there, leaning against a car on the forecourt, breathing harshly and coughing. They walked quickly, keeping to the brightly lit main road instead of taking the darker shortcut. They were still out of breath and nobody spoke. Buddy's lungs felt raw and his elbow ached from where he banged it. "Did you see it?" Julius panted at last. Now that they had their breath back, they all started talking at once. The strange thing was that they had all noticed different things. For Julius, it had been the hand holding the candle, a hand that seemed to float by itself in the darkness. Charmian had seen a face so pale that it looked like a skull, while for Buddy it was the eyes he remembered. Dark, liquid eyes, sunk deep into the whiteness of the face. They had stared at him without blinking. The only movement had been the dancing reflection of the candle's flame. Chapter 7. The twins' parents had converted the front room of their house into the office of Ribeiro Taxis. There was a large desk, a couple of telephones, and a small shortwave radio set. When Buddy followed the twins in through the door, Mrs. Ribeiro was at the desk, speaking into the microphone. The speaker was crackling with the replies of the drivers. One of the phones was off the hook, and the other was ringing. Mrs. Ribeiro raved to them and pointed at the phone. Charmian picked it up and said, "Good evening, Ribeiro Taxis. Can you hold the line for a moment, please?" She put the receiver down in front of her mother, then led her way back into the room. Then led her way through into the back room. Sorry, I'm all over the place today. Buddy always liked this room. It was clean and neat, but very cosy, the way his house had been before his mum left. There was a small kitchen area off the main room, and they went in there to make some coffee. Now that it was all over and they were safe, they could laugh about how scared they'd been at the house. Julius, however, kept trying to make it seem as weird and mysterious as possible by talking about ghosts. But Buddy and Charmian were certain that they'd seen a human being. "Ghosts don't bend down to peek through letterboxes, Jules," Charmian said. "And anyway, I saw his face. It was a man, I know it." "All right, if it wasn't a ghost, who was it?" "Buddy said nobody lived there." They started off, guessing who the person could have been. Again, Julius made crazy suggestions about murderers or kidnappers, but Charmian said it had probably been a tramp or someone like that. Buddy wasn't sure. He didn't agree with Julius's mad ideas, but he couldn't help thinking there was a bit more of a mystery than Charmian would admit. After all, the house was supposed to be empty, and then that was the story about it being haunted. And those eyes, although they had been human, they hadn't been ordinary. They'd been sad and what? Not normal. When Mrs. Ribeiro came into the room, Charmian stopped talking about 56 Croxley Street and pretended to be talking about the satellite. She needn't have bothered, because Mrs. Ribeiro had barely got through the door before she launched into a long description of the difficult evening she'd had. Buddy was always amazed to hear her talk, because although the twins spoke exactly like all the other kids at school, their mother still had a strong Jamaican accent. It was quite hard to understand now. I cannot do a Jamaican accent very well, but I will try my best. I might have to, we'll see. I swear I'm gonna pull one of I, I swear I'm gonna pull them phones off the line one day, she finished, collapsing onto the sofa between Julius and Charmian and giving them a hug. "You late back? Is what you all been doing, huh?" Charmian lowered her eyes and said, "Oh, nothing. He's still out driving. What do you think?" sighed Mrs. Ribeiro. "Him love the car more than me. I too fat for him now. Hey, Buddy?" The sudden question caught him off guard, and he said, "Yes." There was a moment of confusion in his mind as he tried to remember the question, and then he tried to correct himself. "I mean, no, But no one was listening. Mrs. Ribeiro was slapping her knee and roaring with laughter, and the twins were doubled up. "Honestly, I didn't mean," Buddy began again, but it only made them laugh more. Mrs. Ribeiro now started patting her large stomach that was already wobbling with laughter. This was too much for Julius, who rolled off the sofa onto his knees and started pounding the floor with his fist. Even Buddy's embarrassment faded, and he joined in. "Oh my!" said Mrs. Ribera at last, still chuckling and wiping her eyes. "You say the truth, child. Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings. Yes, indeed. Now you see. Now see they? Them foams again. They fit for drive me mad." "I'll go," Julia said. "No, no. If your daddy hear you on the radio, he want to know why they didn't pack you off to bed an hour ago. You can bring a cup of coffee and a couple of sweet biscuit. Then," she added, giving them both another hug, "the two of you straight to bed." She heaved herself off the sofa. As she passed Buddy, she patted her stomach again and gave him a huge grin. Buddy went into the kitchen with the twins and leaned against the draining board while Charmian made the coffee and Julius opened a big tin of biscuits. Buddy noticed how clean and tidy the kitchen was, and he thought of how dirty his was nowadays. Why couldn't his dad keep the house clean? Julius took the coffee and the biscuits to his mum, and Charmian put the things away and wiped the table where she'd spilled some sugar. Watching her, Buddy's moment of anger at his father suddenly seemed so unfair. After all, how often did he help by doing little things like that? Right, tomorrow he'd make an effort. He'd sweep and clean everywhere until the house looked as good as this one. "I like your mum," he said when Charmian had finished the table. "Yeah, she's all right," Charmian said, "except she's always making us go to bed too early." "Yeah, my mum does too." It was a silly lie, and Buddy looked at the floor. He was so used to lying that he'd forgotten that Charmian knew the truth. To his complete surprise, she leant over and kissed his cheek. He was so startled that he didn't know what to do. His hand started to go to his cheek, but he scratched his chin instead. He didn't want her to think he hadn't liked it and was wiping it away. A door banged and Julius came through from the office. "She says we've got to go to bed now," he groaned. "I'm just going anyway," Buddy said. "What are we going to do about it? You know, the house and everything," Julius asked. "Nothing. What can we do? It's all just stupid anyway." Buddy suddenly felt depressed. The thought of going home, the lies he told, the things inside him. They all made mucking about around an old house seemed childish. Julius started to argue, saying it was good fun. But Charmian broke in, saying, "Buddy's right. It's got nothing to do with us." "Blimey! First interesting thing in years, and you," sneered Julius. "You're like a couple of old women." He pushed a chair about hard up against the table and went out. Buddy and Charmian laughed as they heard him stomp upstairs. There was a moment's awkward silence. "Well, I suppose I'd better go to bed," Charmian said. "Yeah," Buddy said. "See ya." He felt he'd said it too quickly, but there was nothing he could do now except go. He walked across the lounge and opened the door without looking back. "Good night, Buddy," Mrs. Ribeiro called as he went into the office. "You catching bus?" "No, I'll walk." "Outside cold. You're going to catch your death without a coat. You want me to call my husband? He can give you a lift." "No, it's okay, honest." "Does he work all the time?" "Too much, child. Can't get drivers at all. He's supposed to operate all this." She waved her hand at the radio and the phones, but he was out too much. "So if you know any drivers, you tell them about us. What your dad do?" "Oh, things, you know," Buddy mumbled, and started moving to the door. "Your mum worked too?" "Yes. Good night, Mrs. Ribeiro," he said quickly, and went out the door. It was cold outside, and the wind cut through his sweaters. He pulled the sleeves down over his hands and walked fast to keep warm. There were a lot of cars racing along the main road, but the pavements were empty. A police car drew up at some traffic lights as he was crossing the road. The policeman inside looked at him and he tried to act casual. His heart beat fast. He stopped and pretended to look in the shop window as if he hadn't a care in the world. Then he thought they might think he was planning to break in and steal something, so he hurried on. He heard the car rev up behind him as the lights changed. The car passed him slowly, but although one of the policemen stared at him, it didn't stop. Crazy, feeling like that. You hadn't done anything wrong. Not today, anyway. Yet he still felt nervous, even when the car disappeared from view. He knew it was just a mad fear, but ever since that couple of weeks where he'd shoplifted nearly every day, he'd been worried that the police knew or would find out about him. His heart tightened whenever he thought about surveillance cameras in shops. Perhaps they had photographs of him and were just waiting for the moment to arrest him. Perhaps he'd stopped out of the blue like tonight. He'd be stopped out of the blue like tonight just to be asked what he was doing walking alone at night, and one of the policemen would recognise him. Mad. Loads of kids at school nicked things all the time and never got caught. Besides, that was all over. He was never going to do it again, and he hadn't been arrested yet. He was probably safe. His house was dark when he got back. His dad must still be out. He checked upstairs, but his dad's bed was empty, and there were clothes dropped all over the floor. His mum used to complain that he and his dad always left their clothes lying about everywhere. He picked up the clothes and folded them on a chair. The walk home chilled him right through, and it took him ages to get warm in bed. He left the landing light on and the door open, but he still felt rather scared alone in the house. There were creaking noises that sounded just like someone coming up the stairs. He covered his ears and thought back over the evening. Not the house and those eyes. He wouldn't think about that. Mrs. Ribeiro, she was fun. And she said they needed drivers. Perhaps his dad could get a job with them. Julius was a laugh, and Charmian, she was... He woke with a start. There was someone on the stairs. He held his breath and listened. The bathroom light went on and there was the sound of running water. It must be his dad. Buddy looked at his watch. 3:45. Where had he been all this time? He'd never been this late before. After a minute, his dad walked past the door. Buddy wanted to call out, but perhaps his dad would be angry if he asked any questions. At least he was home now. Was Mr. Ribeiro home yet? Or was he still driving through the dark streets? Maybe Charmian and Julius had just been woken up by him as he came in from work. The only difference was they would know where their dad had been until so late, and he didn't. Chapter 8. Buddy got up at 8:30, had breakfast, and started cleaning the rooms downstairs. It took him ages, and they still didn't look as good as when his mum did them. It was an improvement, though, especially the kitchen, which had been in a terrible state. When his dad finally staggered downstairs at 12:15, Buddy asked, "What do you think?" "I think I want a cup of tea," his dad said, rubbing his eyes. "No, the cleaning. I've done all the rooms." "You must be thirsty then, so make some tea." Buddy made the tea and sat down at the table, feeling a bit disappointed. His dad sipped the tea, then looked around the room. "Make a good char lady, you would. How much do you charge?" Buddy smiled. His dad was pleased after all. "Now come on, how much?" "Nothing." Buddy laughed. "Blimey, don't never do nothing for nothing, mate. Let's see. I reckon it's worth a tenner." He reached into his trouser pocket and took out a bundle of notes. He peeled off 2 £5 notes and put them down in front of Buddy. "Go on, they're yours. Plenty more where that came from, and we'll go down the shops later. Get you some trousers." Buddy could hardly believe it, but one look at his dad's smiling face told him it was true. "Where did you—" he began, but his dad tapped him on the cheek. It was a friendly pat, but hard. "Ask me no questions, and I won't tell you no lies. I'm working, right? Now shut your gob and pull us another cup." His dad was in great spirits. He put on a bloody Holly LP and turned it up really loud. The music boomed round the house while they both went upstairs to get ready. "Make sure you've got clean underpants," his dad shouted. "Don't want you showing me up in the shops. My old mum used to say, 'Terry, make sure your undies are clean. If you get knocked down by a car, I don't want the doctors thinking I let you go around dirty.'" Poor old dear meant it too. Bless her heart. They stopped off at a pub on the way to the shops. Buddy was going to wait outside, but his dad told him to come in with him. The pub was crowded, but there was a table near the door. Buddy sat there while his dad went to get the drinks. "There you go," his dad said, putting down a half pint for Buddy and a pint for himself. "It's beer," Buddy whispered. "Course it is. It's a pub, isn't it?" Buddy would have preferred a Coke, but he sipped his beer and pretended to enjoy it. His dad even offered him a cigarette, but he didn't take it. "That's right, son, you stay off 'em. At your age, I was on 20 a day. Now I can't stop," his dad said with a laugh as he lit up. "Lovely though, eh?" Buddy liked the noisy, smoky atmosphere of the pub and the way his dad was treating him like a grown-up. He took a big gulp of his beer and finished it. "Right, little boozer, ain't you?" his dad said, and went to the bar for some more. He came back with 2 pints for himself, another half pint for Buddy, and 4 packets of crisps. "Didn't know what flavour, so I bought 'em all." When they left the pub, the bright sunshine made Buddy squint, and he walked along the street feeling slightly light-headed. Everything his dad said made him laugh. In the first clothes shop they came to, his dad took a pair of bright yellow trousers from the rack and held them up. Buddy got such a fit of giggles that they had to leave. In the next shop, Buddy picked out a pair of very ordinary grey trousers and tried them on. "Bit boring, ain't they?" his dad said when Buddy came out of the changing cubicle. "Why don't you buy some nice drain pipes like these?" he asked, pointing to his own trousers that were so narrow They kept riding up over his pink socks. "They're for school, Dad." "Blimey, my sons are right square," his dad said to the shop assistant. "Now what else you want?" His dad made him buy a couple of shirts and a sweater. Buddy thought of venturing the parka. It was really too small, but his dad had spent enough already. After all, how long would this job last? It certainly paid well, whatever it was. All sorts of questions about the job still buzzed in his head, but he tried to push them away. They walked along the streets looking at the shops, and his dad talking happily about how he would soon be able to get his bike back. "You never know, might get another record shop. That'd be a bit of all right, wouldn't it?" That would be great, but he could still remember the tiny shop filled with records. There'd be posters of Elvis and Buddy and other rock and roll singers on, and the shop had been filled with music. Rock and roll fans, lots of them dressed like his dad in teddy boy clothes, had come from miles away to talk, listen to the music, and buy rare records of the 50s. It had been more like a club than a shop, and his dad had been really happy. Then one night it had burned down. Everything had been destroyed. Buddy had only been 8 at the time, and he could still remember the look on his dad's face when they heard the news. They'd all rushed round there and stood looking at the gaping charred hole where the shop had been. During the fire, the records had melted. As the vinyl had cooled, it set into a hard black stream that flowed across the pavement and into the gutter. There, in the middle of the road, a terrible row had started, where his mum found out that his dad had never bothered to insure the shop. It must have been the first bad row between them that Buddy had ever heard, because even now it made him shudder. Oh, yes, it would be terrific. If his dad could start another shop like that. Oddly enough, though, this sudden hope for the future made Buddy nervous. It hadn't been long after the shop had burned down that his dad had gone to prison. If only he could be sure that he wasn't doing something that might get him into trouble. The thought nagged at him all the rest of the afternoon. And while they were having tea, Buddy finally plucked up the courage to say something. "Mrs. Ribeiro told me they need taxi drivers. You're too young to drive big boots." "Not me. Don't muck around. I meant you." "Me? Working for foreigners? You're having a laugh." "Why?" "'Cause they're foreign, stupid." "You're just racist." "Yeah, so what? Anyway, that's not the point. It's a good job." But what?" His dad put down his knife and fork and glared at him. Buddy longed to go on, to ask what the job was, to beg him not to do anything that might send him back to prison. But he didn't. "I don't get you," his dad said. "First you moan because we ain't got no money, then you moan when I make a bit. You got your trousers, didn't you?" "I'm not moaning," Buddy mumbled. They finished their meal in silence, and Buddy felt awful. His dad was doing it all for him, and he wasn't even grateful. All he did was criticise. It not just about this, it was everything. Things his dad did irritated him, like the noise he made eating and drinking, the unusual clothes he wore, swaggering way he walked. Why couldn't he be more like other kids' dads? He didn't always think like that. There were times when he loved the fact that his dad was different. He liked it when he mucked around and was glad that he wasn't like Mr. Normington and people of that sort. It was all so confusing. Sometimes these opposite feelings swirled about inside Buddy's mind, and he wished he could open his head like a window and let it all go flying out. And we'll leave it there for today. Poor old Buddy does seem like he's going through the ringer a bit, doesn't he? He seems a bit mixed up and confused. But I quite like the idea of his dad starting another record shop. That sounds fun, doesn't it, Freddy? We like music in our house, don't we? Yeah. Do you think Buddy's dad, will start another new record shop? You do? I hope so too, but we'll see. I'm a bit worried that his dad might end up doing something silly. But we'll see what happens tomorrow when we read another instalment. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Thank you for subscribing, for commenting. It really makes my day when you do. And Freddie and I will see you soon. Hopefully with our new edition. Can you wave, Freddie? Good girl. Cheerio, everybody.